Hi everybody, welcome back. Our next panel talk this afternoon is with editor Owen McGurk. It was supposed to be with Laura Way, the director who's working very closely with him, but unfortunately Laura's not very well this afternoon. So we have got Owen and myself for the afternoon, which is great. Welcome Owen, thank you so much for joining everybody.
Hello. Hi, Deborah. Sorry. You're just stuck with me now.
That's great.
instead of Laura. So, she's not well.
No worries at all. I think the whole premise of this talk, but we can go into more about your background and editing and things, was to talk about long distance relationships. So it's your relationship with your director, with the creatives on a project as an editor, and kind of the working remotely. So that's kind of our topic for today, everybody. Owen, tell us a bit about your background and how you got into editing and some of the projects you've worked on.
How I got into editing, I sort of fell into it initially, as in I was living in Greece, and I think I'd spent 3 summers in Greece and one winter, and I was bored, and I found out that my mother's cousin knew somebody in London, and did I want to go there? And I ended up in Soho, initially working as a runner on ads, and then I don't know what it was about me on set, but a couple of people on set figured I might like it better in the cutting rooms, and I ended up in Soho, which I loved, on Darblay Street in the middle of the 90s, which was a very kind of exciting place to be. We were over Black Market Records, and it was just so it was right at the crossover. It was I think the first Avid I switched on was the first time I'd seen an Apple computer, and it was so that was initially how it was. And after a little while of doing that, I decided I wanted to try other things, camera and whatnot, and I went to film school. And of course, when I got to film school, because I'd used an Avid, I was instantly the editor. And it sort of, there were various versions of that over the years where I did bits of AD work, I did bits of camera work, did, the various different departments, but I'd always end up back in the cutting room. And I think where it finally clicked for me that this was definitely the place for me was when I got the job as first assistant on Bachelor's Walk, the John Carney. Yeah. Carney Brothers show, and I loved it. And weirdly, I was meant to be trainee AD on a movie with Jennifer Love Hewitt that summer. It fell through at the last second, and the day that it fell through was the day I got the job in Bachelor's Walk, and that was kind of the end of that. I haven't looked back since. So that was 20 years ago, I suppose. Amazing. Yeah.
And talk to us about what
I'm actually in the very room that I worked in on Bachelor's Walk at the moment. So this
20 years later.
Weird bit of serendipity.
Brilliant. Talk to us about the type of projects. What are you working on at the moment, or what type of projects have you done the last few years?
I suppose I seem to be doing a lot of TV the last few years. The last feature I did was a thing with Cillian Murphy and Andrew Scott called Delinquent Season, but I don't think that did as well as people wanted it to. So I seem to be just doing TV the last few years, which I really like the kind of energy of TV. So bigger shows would have been like Kin and The Outlaws, the Stephen Merchant show that last year. And with Laura Way, I did a thing called Maxine about the Soul murders that's on Netflix, and also a show that was just went out on BBC called Dead and Buried earlier this year, which I think was what we were going to
talk about today.
Talk about primarily, yeah. A lot of TV shows basically for the last 5-6 years, yeah.
Fantastic.
Which is that's the way the industry has gone, I suppose.
I kind of like TV over features because they tend to have a deadline. You have tighter deadlines. You've got schedules.
They do have it.
Features can drag on a lot longer. We've got a lady in the audience here who was talking about a feature that the edit dragged on for over a year.
That sounds exhausting. I like the rhythm of TV and there's different things that are better about each one. Like the great thing about a feature is everybody's concentrated on that one story, the one story you're trying to tell. And I suppose the drawback of TV is sometimes you feel like you're kind of spinning plates, or you're just trying to hit deadlines. You're just trying to work a schedule, but it's it flies by, I suppose. TV, features can drag sometimes. Right.
Talk to us, Owen, about, in your experience, how does remote work sort of influence, the creative when you're editing versus in person when you're sitting in a room with your director? Like what you would have sat with Laura in projects and Kate Dolan when you were in Windmill doing Kin, versus kind of working remotely from home or running a project solo. How does that work for you?
Well, I suppose there's various kind of, in terms of, obviously things, in terms of my experience of remote things, like obviously I was an assistant for years, and I'm quite jealous of, in some ways, of assistants, just to take it back from before I actually stepped up to be an editor. So obviously the advantages for assistants of, setting things going at 11 o'clock, late, and being able to go home instead of waiting around for a courier that might never come at midnight. I'm definitely a bit jealous of that side of things, in terms of, so that started coming in towards the end of when I was an assistant, say things like TeamViewer or Log Me In, where you didn't have to physically be there all the time. And that, I remember thinking that was very freeing, but my time as an assistant was pretty much over then. So, but in terms of how it has affected things with directors, well, actually, sorry, just one thing to go back to in terms of being an assistant. Like, I'm always, I think whatever time you start out and whatever time you're working your way through, there's always different things that are advantageous. Like, obviously, I just missed out on film, which is what the job I thought I was going to. I think I was telling you the other day, the first film cutting room I walked into I was trying to get my union card signed, was in the old Windmill Lane, and it was a film cutting room for Pacoon, and there must have been 6-7 people in the room. It was a big room. They were all hanging strips of film and in bins, and I thought, this looks fantastic. I want to do this, and I never got to do that, obviously. And so that what happened was then, so I worked in, it was largely digital, like so basically everything was through Avid, and then like it was the tail end of people shooting things on film. So I suppose the thing that I do wonder with remote editing is I was always in the room with the editor or in the room with producers for screenings, and you learn a huge amount that way, or I did. That I do wonder about people coming up now, whether you'll lose that, just seeing people handle certain situations well or handle them badly. You can learn things both ways. By the way, I have my assistant Jack is in the room with me, so
hi, Jack.
So I'm not the most evangelical person for remote. I'm remoting in to say that I'm not 100% on remote workloads, but
we
in terms of
we were talking to John Phillipson earlier, and one of the things he was talking about was John Phillipson and Bob, like their home setups versus kind of, say, walking into that room and screen seeing where you are now. But I think we counted that John had 7 screens that he uses when we added everything up. So it has to be very difficult, say, transitioning from going, I'm working from home, to this room where you're in right now, to go, does your spec, does your setup have everything? Like, are there any specific adjustments you feel like you've had to make when you're working remotely from home or in different facilities? How does it work?
Well, actually, John Phillipson is meant to be in the room next to me at Screen, but instead is down in Wicklow, obviously working from home.
Wexford today, Wicklow.
Wexford today, sorry. Well, the thing for me, I don't have a home setup. I've only ever worked from home. Although ironically, we're building an extension at the moment that will include a home office, but any time I've worked from home, which is the only time I've really done it editing wise, was the first couple of weeks of COVID, where I had started a job called Red Election, and we got shut down because on whatever, the 16th of March or whatever it was in 2020. And the only thing we had in the can was this big set piece, which was the opening episode. Red Election was like a spy show with Russian spies and whatnot. And there was a big opening set piece involving, some poison gas being released in a supermarket. And obviously there was a huge amount of, the producers were very nervous, given that they didn't know, nobody knew what was going to happen whether we would ever get to work again or the whole world was going to end. So I basically had to go home and cut together this opening 15 minutes of the series just to, put everybody at ease. So the thing that I found working from home, and I suppose what colors my feeling about it, is that I ended up, I would wake up at 5 a.m. and I would start working on this sequence. And then, my kids were there. I have 3 kids who are school age, and they were in the house, and they were very respectful of my space, and they weren't a distraction, but I always knew they were there. And so I would end up kind of, not finishing at 7 o'clock at night. I would work on, I would put them to bed, and then I would go back to work again. And I found after a few weeks of that, I felt, a little depressed, basically.
Your work-life balance, it works for some people and not as much for others.
I had no discipline that way. I've been able to separate the two things. So it felt like I was just always in work. And the thing I would compare it to is whenever I was on set, I often liked going away on location, which again is not a thing that happens really with editors so much anymore. But you would go away on location, and the crew, the cast, everybody be in the same hotel, and you would have your hotel room, and usually very close by would be the cutting room. And it was very hard to not find yourself working round the clock. Like there was nothing else to do. You would just work and either go to the bar or just keep working. Like there was nothing else. And you would go a little crazy after, 5 or 6 weeks or whatever. Yeah. So I'm not, I'm somebody who likes to go somewhere in the morning, do my work, and then go home.
Switch off
so
again. I'm not, kind of personal preference.
But I should say now, there's certain advantages for me in that, I was born in London. I'm from Dublin. Those are 2 cities. I have family in both cities. Those are 2 cities they're 2 places with post-production industries of some description or size. So that's a big advantage for me. Obviously, that's not the same for everybody. And obviously, I can imagine, that obviously being able to do things remotely, if you're not from somewhere like that, where you can
breaks down barriers, it creates an opportunity, which maybe it didn't pre-COVID. How do you kind of find then, so your preference is obviously, you're in a room and screen scene now, you're working in a production that typically the audio might be, in another part of the building, VFX. How do you maintain that strong creative vision? Take your Dead and Buried project, for example. I think you mentioned your assistant was in Belfast, and
Dead and Buried.
Dead and Buried, apologies. So it's, how do you find keeping kind of the creative when you're working the edit, when the entire teams can be remote in different places? So not necessarily so you can be in there, but your producer, your director could be somebody your teams to work with could be based in other places.
Yeah, I suppose there are 2 ways to look at it. Obviously, it creates, a lot of the jobs I've done in the last 5 years, it basically wouldn't be able to do without remote editing. I'm sitting here in Dublin, but the director on this job I'm on, I'll get on to Dead and Buried, the specific that, but they're shooting in Budapest. After the shoot's over, he's going to go back to his home in Cumbria, and then we'll talk over, Zoom or Evercast or whatever, or Parsec or whatever we're going to use on this. And obviously that obviously remote editing has allowed situations like that, which have proliferated over the last 3 years, say 3-4 years. I think once people saw what was capable during COVID, or what remote editing was capable of during COVID, then there's obviously that is a thing that happens now increasingly. What I would say is that, I suppose specifically in terms of this job, I always think just in terms of dealing with the director, whatever way the director wants to do it and whatever the production can afford is the best way to do it. And you have to adjust as the editor to that. It's not the fact is my preference would be actually that the director would be here in the room with me all through the fine cut, and that's what I enjoy the most. However, if that's not the director's preference, then there's absolutely nothing to be gained by me insisting that they sit here. If they don't want to be here, that's not a good way of working. So obviously, if they're and obviously, we're talking about Laura, specifically Laura Way, who's meant to be here today, was the first job I did with Laura was Maxine, and I think it was our first time working together. We didn't know each other so well. It was a relatively, I think it was a really short shoot and a really short post schedule. Like, I think it was 12 weeks from the first day of the shoot to the lock of the third episode. And Laura was in the room with me for most of the fine cut. And there were small aspects of remote editing where she would go back down to Wexford, obviously, because she's a young child. But it was largely in the room. Now, what happened the second time around with Dead and Buried, obviously we already had a pre-existing relationship, and she trusted me.
There's trust. I said the trust is very important to build up when you're editor. If you're working together like that, it has to be so important.
I kind of always think trust is almost everything between a director and an editor. Like, if they don't trust you, they need to find someone they can trust. Like, there's no amount of technical knowledge or expertise or craft that can overcome if somebody fundamentally doesn't trust you. And I'm very lucky. I've never quite had that, but I've seen that happen when I was an assistant. I saw that happen to editors, and they got fired. I mean, that's what happened. If the director doesn't feel that they can trust you, they need somebody who does.
That's really tricky when it comes to something like TV drama, whenever the schedules are so tight, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe this is why you don't see editors get fired so often. There's just no time to replace them. But you see it. But yeah, you're right. That's probably like where you see it happen more on features, which tend to be a bit more cutthroat towards the editors. But in terms of Laura and remote editing on Dead and Buried, so it was very different. She wanted to be at home more with her son, which absolutely, and also because we already had a kind of well-established way of working together, like, as in I understood what she liked, and she understood what I could do, and she trusted what I would do with the story or my feelings on performance or whatever, or where, if I would have ideas that would veer away from the script or want to create ditch all the dialogue in a couple of scenes I didn't like and make a sort of visual sequence out of it that I thought would work better. She trusted me to do these things. There was no need for her to sit there and watch me do it. Yeah. She would, and that's great as well. Like, it was great to have that someone have that kind of confidence in you that they go, you tell them the thing you intend to do, and they say, okay, well, you go and do it, and then we will, I'll jump on Zoom afterwards, and especially because we already got on well, it meant that, I suppose the thing that one of the main issues with, say, Zoom or whatever is that, like, little kind of delay of not being exactly in the room. It's sort of like what's happening with you and me now. It's like a little, exactly. So, and that in editing, where timing is so important.
Key,
it can be like, oh, sorry, what did you not like? No, not that. Like, and this, and like, even I know they're getting quicker. The delay used to be, like, going back 5 years ago, was worse than it is now. Yeah. But it's still a thing of, and just that thing of being in the room where they go, someone pointing at a screen and going,
And some of that is technical, and some of that is just human interaction and communication. And
well, a lot of obviously I have no idea how much of communication is non-verbal, but there's a certain amount of just being in the room with someone and feeling them not react to something. Or feeling their unease at a certain part, or hearing them go, just very quiet.
Silence.
Exactly. Or exactly. Them not reacting when you want them to. The laugh that doesn't come, or comes in the wrong place. Yeah. And all those things are very subtle, and they can be sort of filtered out by remote editing, unfortunately. Now I should say, sorry if I sound too negative about it, I think it's a great second best to having. that thing of, it's definitely, I think it's definitely preferable to just purely a notes-based editing, which again has its place. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that either, but I wouldn't like to work purely just getting notes, typed notes from a director, go do this, do that, like, because obviously they're you completely lose the connection of the real thing. Like the great thing again with if somebody's remoting in and they ask you to do something and they can see you do it, if they can see it's not working while you're doing it, it saves you doing it. Doing it like often if you get a note that doesn't work, you often end up, I don't know how other editors, but I know I almost end up working twice as hard trying to make it work, even though it doesn't. And then you have to send it to them. And then they watch it, and then they say it doesn't work. And there's an extra.
How did you find the communication worked? For example, like to keep the creativity up on your project whenever, say, your assistant was in Belfast on that particular project and you in Dublin?
On Dead and Berry.
With that one as an example, or talk about other projects, but just that communication of keeping the creativity kind of on the project alive.
Specifically with Dead and Berry, I suppose. Now, I thought Lee was great, my assistant. I really didn't like having him in Belfast. I didn't, and in terms of the thing that it did really cut down on was the creative aspect of having an assistant. I suppose because I was an assistant for a good 10 years, so I'm always keen for anybody who assists me to try and get them cutting, to give them feedback on their work, so that they are like another editor on the job. I try and get them to do as much creatively as possible, and because it's fun for me, I think it usually makes the job more interesting for them. And obviously with Lee in Belfast, it just really wasn't possible in the same way, because if you're doing stuff like that, you're usually trying to fit that stuff in whenever you can. Like, can we look at that? Like, if I give a scene to Jack to do, when he'll have it done, he'll say, like, do you have 2 minutes to look at it? And either I do or I don't. But that's really easy if you're in the room. That's much less easy if someone has to send you an email or ring you and stop you. And
schedule a Zoom call.
Yeah, exactly. So, but it acts as a kind of, as a prophylactic, it stops you from even asking. So you end up, so I suppose with Lee, I was keenly aware that any time he did have creative stuff to do, like the work he did on the recaps and teasers and stuff, it was great. But there was so much I didn't ask him to do that I would have asked him to do if he was.
And that kind of probably connects into feedback, like you giving him feedback on his work or anybody else. That's kind of trickier remotely than it would be sitting in the room beside you.
Absolutely. And also because obviously when you give work to do to an assistant, obviously usually they're learning, and that's a kind of vulnerable thing for them to be, to you sitting in judgment on their work. And obviously if you're in the room, that sort of takes the edge off things, hopefully, like as in, a written down feedback can look really harsh. And over the phone, you might come across harsh, and I feel the same way with Zoom. Just because there's not that physical connection between you, it maybe it just changes the nature of it, I think. Whereas
it's a tone. I guess there's always a tone that can kind of go into an email or go into a chat that can be very different if you're sitting beside a person in real life.
Absolutely, and those things are hard to quantify how they affect things. All I know is that in terms of Dead and Buried, I would have loved to have gotten Lee to do more, but the fact that he was 150 miles up the road
makes it a bit trickier. And speaking to the likes of Jack in the room with you, and the likes of other new entrants and new assistants, and people coming out of colleges, like we were talking before about COVID being very tough on the new entrants to the industry and the juniors. Like speaking from Windmill's perspective, we used to have 5 or 6 runners. There was always these teams of juniors there, and if they weren't in the kitchen area, they were sitting in on an edit, sitting in on a sound mix, sitting in a VFX session. It's really tough since kind of those internships, those work placements, those runners have gone. How does somebody, get a foot in the door in your world in editing to start an assistant editor? What advice would you give them, kind of? to get the foot in the door?
I don't know. The truth is, I kind of, I don't know, because I would, listen, I'm sure just the way I felt like I'd missed out on things without ever being in a film cutting room. I'm sure there's things like now that we've moved to a more remote editing world, there are absolutely things that people coming into the industry now will miss out on. But then there are other things that I can't predict that they will experience that wouldn't have been possible anyway. But I suppose, yeah, like I say, it was always a lot of the really educational moments for me were just the being in a room with directors, producers, editors who I admired, and listening to them talk, listening to them to either deal with political situations in terms of there's an awful lot of politics that goes into film and TV. So seeing people manage situations like that, I don't know how you would pick up on those things remotely, so I'm not sure. What I would say to anybody starting now is, when I was starting out, like I say, a lot of the editors I worked for had come from a purely film background and really didn't know how to use computers almost at all. And so the computers were not as intimidating to me because I'd had a Spectrum and I've played on my friends' Commodores and Amstrads and stuff. So it wasn't totally alien to me. I'd never actually switched on a Mac until I switched on an Apple. So it wasn't like I wasn't really focused on computers, but it basically wasn't as intimidating to me as it was to a lot of the editors that I initially worked for. And I remember seeing a gap there in that they didn't want to engage with this new thing. They wanted it to go back to being film, and it never was. And I remember I would sometimes pick up on things they would say, where the digital editing had, obviously changed what was possible, and they weren't seeing those possibilities, and I was. So I would say to anybody listening to me going, if they can spot gaps in the way, in the assumptions that I have about how things should or will be done, exploit those, because that's how I was able to. I definitely saw a way that things were going digitally that basically, as a previous generation of editors basically kind of were phasing out because they didn't want to take that leap into a kind of new paradigm or whatever. What I would say though, one thing, my last experience of something like that, whereby I assisted a woman. She was a fantastic editor who had been a film editor. She worked as an assistant in the 80s. She'd been a big film editor in the 90s. And then she'd taken a break to have a kid. She'd married someone who was extremely wealthy, and this stopped working altogether. But then she got divorced and she needed to work again. And I ended up being her assistant. And I remember initially, because she hadn't worked since, I think, 1997, and this is about 10 years ago.
Wow. That's so a nice gap.
But she suddenly, she had this job on a feature with a quite demanding director. She could not switch on a computer, let alone work the Avid. I mean, one of the first things I did, she could use the space bar, the in, the out, the lift, and cut. That was it. 5 buttons. Everything else I had to do for it, which was great for me because I was, I had a huge amount to do to just fill in the gaps of everything else. But what I would say is, on the first day, I rather arrogantly thought I should be the editor. I know how to work the Avid and she doesn't, kind of thing. And by the end of the first day, I was like, no, okay, I get it. She, with the 5 buttons she knew, she was still a much, much better editor than I was. And what I would say is, so again, what I would say to obviously anybody starting out now, yes, look for ways in which the new kind of world evolving, you can spot how things are changing, and in a way that somebody older maybe can't or does, or is too kind of reluctant to let go of things. But also at the same time, I do think the fundamental things of how editing works probably haven't changed really that much in 100 years. How you make a scene land, how you make people feel something, how you craft a performance. These things are the sort of, if you can't, those ultimately are the thing you have to learn anyway. You can't.
That's a skill. That technology won't
Yeah.
change. That skill still has to exist no matter how much the technology
Absolutely.
advances. Yeah.
Yeah, there's an underlying thing you have to master, which is not the software, it is not the machine, and it's more to do with an emotional thing to do with drama and storytelling, and that thing won't change. So I would keep those two things in mind. Look to exploit any technological advances, but also, yeah, try and remember that actually that's not the job. Mastering the machine or the software. I was saying to Jack earlier, like it's kind of like, you're learning to drive. You think you'll never be able to, particularly a stick shift, like do everything at once. How do you want to get to the point where you're not even really conscious of the fact that you're driving. You're just trying to get somewhere. And I
Becomes
suppose
natural.
Yeah, well, you think it's natural, but it's not, obviously. You learn how to do it. Nobody naturally at 3 years old knows how to drive, and nobody knows how to edit either. I remember being, people trying to flatter you, saying you were a natural. It's like, it never felt natural to me editing. I certainly didn't feel natural when I was learning it. But it might appear that way afterwards, after you've learned. It's it's a language that you learn. But yeah, in terms of the software, in terms of the hardware around you, I suppose it's always a case of you want to master it enough so that it's not holding you back and that you can achieve the things you want to do within the story. But but I'm not sure. That's not really a remote editing thing. It's more just
No, it kind of work. It works for both sides of it. But
Yeah.
I'm going to put it out here. Has anybody got any questions for Owen while we're here? Anybody in the room? Anything jumping out? Anybody online? I'm looking at Rebecca. Any? No, you're obviously so full of wisdom, Owen. Have you got any exciting projects or anything coming up you want to tell us about?
No,
Before we wrap up?
I was going to say, like, just in terms of, I suppose I did just in terms of jobs I did that had a remote, like, say we were talking about Kin. So when I was on the first season of Kin, I only came in at the end, and I was working with. I think it was still lockdown.
Yeah.
Or there was a lockdown. So Tessa, who was the director, she was based in London. I think she came over to shoot some pickups, but it was all totally remote. And the person I was dealing with most was Peter.
Peter the writer, Peter McKenna, yeah.
Yeah. So, and I dealt with him really closely, and it was only on season 2 that I realised that we'd never met in person.
Yeah.
Because when I met him in person, he was much, much taller than me.
We found that John, who spoke on one of the earlier panels that works in Windmill with me, was he had met Emma Fleischer, who was the producer of it, in Windmill one day.
Oh, yeah.
But she stopped him, and he spoke to her, and she just looked at him completely blankly. He'd been on set the whole time for all the VFX supervision, but everybody was always wearing a mask. So you'd never met somebody face to face without a mask to recognise who they were.
But I never. It was funny because in terms of me talking about the drawbacks or whatever, I was shocked that myself and Peter hadn't been in a room together. It felt like we had been.
Yeah.
I wasn't aware of that because we'd been talking every day for hours. You sort of forget about the apparatus. It does kind of. It does melt away a little bit. So yeah, I was surprised that we'd never met. But yeah,
and that he was tall, and that he was as tall as what he was.
Yeah, no, I'm not. I'm much taller on Zoom. I'm not like on this screen. I'm not that big.
Love it.
But yeah, that was kind of interesting. And I have had several. Sorry, for somebody who, like, obviously I'm not particularly evangelical about remote. the amount of times now in the last 5 years where I've never been in the same country as the director, and yeah, it doesn't. It's funny because actually, on a day-to-day basis, there are advantages, and obviously, I've talked about the disadvantages, but actually, there are advantages too. In that, there is a peculiar focus that happens when you're both staring at the same thing on a screen, because you can just hear each other talking. I can hear them, they can hear me, and but we're both watching the same feed of picture and sound, and that in itself means that you're focused on it. There's far less kind of chit chat because you both sort of, it has a kind of hypnotic power where it kind of sucks you in, and hours do fly by that way. So I would kind of think that sometimes it can be oddly productive in a way that being in a room with somebody can be distracting.
Yeah.
You you spend much less time trying to amuse each other through Zoom. But I will say also that there is a thing, I suppose, with anybody who does Zoom meetings. Obviously, if you're on Zoom or Parsec or Evercast for 8, 9, 10 hours, it can be weirdly exhausting at the end of the day.
You press that leave button and you're left there in a room on your own.
I often liken it to stepping out of a pub in the middle of the day. It just
I like the comparison.
it's a weird feeling. Not that I do much of that anymore. I remember that being a thing. It's quite draining. And again, I think for me anyway, after having done a 10-hour Evercast session, the ability to, like, if I'm here in Screen Scene or Windmill or Outer Limits, whatever, the ability to just leave that room behind me and go home far away from it. It's important for me anyway, and I don't know how, like, John manages what he does, where he's still there all the time. I need to put distance between me and it. But there you go.
Brilliant. Owen, thank you very, very much indeed for joining us today. Thank you so much.
Oh, right, okay. Oh, yeah, no worries. I know I have to get back to work, so I've got another deadline today, like at 6 o'clock. So
brilliant.
my director in Hungary, he's an hour ahead and he wants to see things at 7. So I better crack on.
Let you keep going. Brilliant.
Yeah, hopefully I'll see you again in person.
Absolutely. Sounds great, Owen. Thanks so much.
All right, cheerio. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.